Welcome to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. Benjamin Franklin said, "Whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech." Who's censoring speech today? Facebook, Twitter, Google, and YouTube, which is owned by Google. Those big tech companies, along with many others, are censoring the public conversation, and they pose a serious danger to our republic, to the point that their censorship might even throw the election. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that. There is a genuine threat that the algorithms big tech uses, along with the conscious decisions of the humans that run it, nearly all of whom lean heavily to the left, will so manipulate the political conversation throughout the United States that they can choose the winner of the next election and make it happen. How? Well, let's start with Google. Google is, of course, the big search giant. When people want to look something up, over 90% of them go to Google, including myself. Even though I hate Google as a company, I acknowledge that their search results are usually pretty good. They can be biased, but they're pretty good in eventually getting to what you want. Or if it's not political, getting directly to what you want. So as much as I hate Google, I do use them as my primary search engine. Just by manipulating the search results, they can change the conversation. What would happen if somebody were to look up, just as a for instance, just the two simple words, President Trump? If the first 2 pages of results of that search were stories against President Trump, would that manipulate the viewpoint? Versus if the first 2 pages of that search were all positive stories about President Trump? Of course it would. The same thing about Joe Biden. If you were to type in Joe Biden, the search results can manipulate your perception of Joe Biden based upon whether they fed you a bunch of positive stories about Joe Biden or a bunch of negative stories about Joe Biden. None of which have to be false. There's plenty of good to say about Joe. There's plenty of bad to say about Joe. There's plenty of good to say about Donald. There's plenty of bad to say about Donald. But if the people who are feeding the information, which these days, big tech is who is feeding that information. Between Google, Facebook, and Twitter, you got 90% of the country covered right there. And by manipulating what it is people see, they steer the perception and they move the needle. And they don't have to move that needle very far. I'll give you some actual numbers here in a moment. But one of the better known cases of Google manipulating their platform, along with YouTube, because they're the same, is what they've done with PragerU videos. PragerU is a website run by Dennis Prager. And PragerU puts out videos that are typically only about 5 minutes because they understand that most people aren't going to give you much more than that. People's attention spans are pretty short. But the PragerU videos take about 5 minutes to explain a topic. Now, obviously, they can't go into a whole lot of detail in 5 minutes, but they're very well produced. What they contain are facts that most people don't know. In fact, the motto for PragerU is, "We teach what isn't taught." And they have experts in their field giving seldom heard information about the truth on race relations, American history, climate change, economics, abortion, and many other topics. Free speech, hate speech, there's a bunch of them. And if you go straight to PragerU.com, you can see them all. But if you do a search on YouTube for them, or you do a search on Google, many of those videos are going to be blocked. Not to the point that nobody can see them, but to the point that only adults with verified, registered accounts can see them. Because Google and YouTube, remember they're the same company, have determined that those videos are somehow dangerous. How can the knowledge shared in those videos be considered dangerous by Google? Well, they are. And as a result, they're blocked behind either those age-restricted user accounts I just mentioned, or in some cases, these corporate firewalls, which almost all public schools and many universities use. You can't get it past the firewall even if you are of age and watch it. And there's nothing indecent or obscene about any of these videos. But people who want to see them can't. Now, Dennis Prager sued over that and was not successful. The court threw it out on the grounds that Google is a private corporation and therefore not subject to First Amendment restrictions, which is true. They are a private corporation not subject to First Amendment restrictions. But there are other laws that come into play on that, specifically Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which I'll address later. But I want to give an example of how Google and YouTube manipulated the results of a search that I did recently. On June 14th, there was a boat parade to celebrate Flag Day and President Trump's birthday. And I wrote a commercial for it, which Chris Dosev, who was the organizer of that boat parade, voiced. And Chris Dosev then called me and asked me, hey, can you make a video commercial as well? Now, he wasn't planning to buy any television time, but he wanted to put it on Facebook and some other media platforms where people could see the video on the internet. Well, I'm a radio guy. I have no ability to do videos, not decent ones anyway. I mean, I can do the very basics in Windows Movie Maker, which if you know anything about video editing, you know that that is the simplest program on earth, and basically what I'm capable of doing is setting the begin point and the end point and maybe inserting some video in between, but not much more than that. My video skills are very rudimentary. But I've got a friend who owns a video production company. He can do phenomenal stuff. So I called him up and I asked him, hey, I've got this radio commercial for the Trump boat parade. We want to produce a video for it that uses this radio commercial as the voice. Will you assemble a commercial for us? And oh, by the way, there's no money in it, so this is strictly to support the cause. And his answer was he'd be happy to do it, but he didn't have the time to find the videos. But that if I went to YouTube and found some rah-rah pro-Trump video, he'd be glad to assemble it and use the Chris Dosev voiceover that I produced and make it into a commercial. So I figured, where's the best place to find pro-Trump video where there wouldn't be a problem with licensing for us to use? And I figured, what better place than a Trump campaign commercial? Because obviously President Trump isn't going to put negative videos about himself in his own commercials. And since they're his commercials, he's not going to object to any kind of copyright infringement. So I went to Google and I typed in Trump campaign commercials. And the first 2 pages of results were all anti-Trump stories. Some of them were commercials against President Trump. Others were news stories. And others were just opinion pieces that had videos enclosed. But 100% of the first 2 pages of Google results, when I was asking specifically for Trump campaign commercials, the results were all negative anti-Trump pages. And then I remembered, oh, that's right, Donald Trump ran a commercial during the Super Bowl. So I modified my search term. And instead I typed in Trump Super Bowl commercial. And the very first result was the Trump Super Bowl commercial. But the next 2 pages of results were all negative. All a bunch of anti-Trump stuff. That's the way the bias happens. And to prove the hypothesis I held, I also typed in Hillary Clinton campaign commercials. And you know what came up the first 2 pages? A bunch of Hillary Clinton campaign commercials. There's bias right there. And don't think this is not deliberate. It's very deliberate. In April of 2019, a woman named Kay Cole James was asked by Google to serve on the company's artificial intelligence advisory panel. But the people already serving on that advisory panel went ballistic and demanded that Google rescind the offer. And Google did. They caved to the leftist mob that exists internally within Google. Now, normally, Kay Cole James would check a few of the left's victim boxes, and that would have boosted her support. You see, she was a 69-year-old black woman, and a real biological woman, not a man who self-identified as a woman. That would have given him, her, whatever, even more bonus points. But in this case, she was a real woman, and a real black person. You'd think she'd be a shoo-in, but no. Kay Cole James was the president of the Heritage Foundation, and they're a conservative think tank. So that automatically made this black female a racist and a misogynist who hates black people and women. And that was enough to keep her off the board. She would have been the only person on the board who wasn't a radical activist leftist. And Google just couldn't have that kind of ideological diversity pollute their ranks. Google wouldn't even allow one conservative voice on their advisory board. This wasn't even their board of directors. This was just an advisory board. This board had no real power. The company could have easily ignored her advice. But they didn't want any conservatism anywhere near their company. And it should be noted that over the course of her career, Kay Cole James advocated for many pro-black policies that led to improving the lives of many black people. But because those successful policies didn't rely on Democrats in government, they don't count. She's a racist. And because she's a conservative, Google wanted nothing to do with her. Now, I'm going to cite some examples of Facebook and Twitter as well. But I want to tell you how little the needle needs to be moved by Google's manipulation, and by any of big media's manipulation. It's not like they have to convince 100% of the people. They don't even have to convince half the people. I looked at the results of the 2016 election, and I calculated just how much that needle would have to move. Care to guess? 10%? 7%? 5%? 3%? 1%? How much would the needle have to have moved in 2016 to change the outcome of the election and put Hillary Clinton in the White House instead of Donald Trump? If Hillary Clinton, instead of Donald Trump, had won Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, she would have been the 45th president of the United States. Donald Trump won Michigan by 0.3%. He won Pennsylvania by 1.2%. And he won Wisconsin by 1.0%. If 54,000 people had changed their votes and voted for Hillary instead of Donald, Hillary would have won. And 54,000 is 0.039% of the total votes cast nationwide. That is 39 thousandths of a percent. So how much does the needle need to move? If it's targeted properly, 39 thousandths of a percent. And that's something big tech can easily accomplish. I'll give you some other examples of Facebook and Twitter and others improperly censoring people. when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So I have been suspended from Facebook on numerous occasions. I'm what they call a habitual offender. What's my offense? Stating the truth that some Stalinist censor at Facebook objects to. I have had my Facebook account suspended no fewer than 10 times. And whenever it is suspended, I get this very vague notice that says, "You're temporarily blocked from posting. This temporary block will last 30 days, and you won't be able to post on Facebook until it's finished. If you post something that goes against our community standards again, your account will be blocked for another 30 days. Please keep in mind that people who repeatedly post things that aren't allowed on Facebook may have their accounts permanently disabled." So what were my violations of their precious community standards? I have no idea. Because they aren't specific when they notify you that you've somehow run afoul of those standards. But I'll share with you my most recent one, and then you can see if you can figure it out. So this is a post that I did in May 16th, and it got taken down, and I got a message from Facebook that said, "Your post goes against our community standards on hate speech. We have these standards because we want discussions on Facebook to be respectful." Which, if you've ever read a discussion on Facebook, you know that respectful ain't the standard. But what is it that I said? Well, I printed out that post, so I know exactly what I said. And it had to do with the Ahmaud Arbery shooting in Brunswick, Georgia. And I'll read it to you. And then you see if you can figure out where in here there is any hate speech that goes against somebody's community standards. Here we go. "The Democrats and the media, but I repeat myself, are telling us that the video of the shooting death of Ahmaud Arbery shows the callous murder of an unarmed black man by racist redneck vigilantes who the mayor of Atlanta said were motivated by President Trump's racism. But it also raises dozens of questions for which we do not yet know the answers. I'm withholding judgment until the investigation is complete. If the evidence supports murder charges and convictions, I'd be willing to inject the needles into the killers myself. But in the meantime, I will not perpetuate the lie that white people can kill black people and face no consequences. On this morning's program, I interviewed a retired deputy U.S. Marshal who is now a professor of criminal justice in Georgia. He is a rare voice of reason who explained why it's too soon to reach a conclusion as to what happened in Brunswick, Georgia on February 23rd. Whether the video is all the evidence you think you need, or if you are withholding judgment until you have more facts, it is worth your time to listen to the interview. It is archived online at www.themikebateshow.com/podcast/200516. Gee, did you hear anything in there that constituted hate speech or that wasn't respectful? Well, here's the ironic thing about that. The first time they took that down, there was an option there to request a review of that decision. I clicked on that button hoping that there would be a place to type in an explanation of what was written, but there wasn't. "Oh, gee, thank you," is all it said. "We'll review it and get back to you." And the response I got was, and I didn't write this down, so I'm only paraphrasing it, but, "Hey, thanks for letting us review it. We've looked it over again and decided that it does not violate our community standards, so we've put it back up. Thank you for being a part of the Facebook family," or whatever. And then a day or so later, I got another takedown notice on the exact same post, this one having no appeal button whatsoever. Go figure. Am I annoyed by it? Sure I am. While I'm annoyed that they take down my stuff, the fact is that I recognize that I'm a voice on the radio in Northwest Florida. Yeah, some people listen online around the country, but for the most part, I'm a voice in Northwest Florida. I'm not a national figure. But James Woods, the actor, is a national figure. He had his Twitter account suspended for hate speech. Now, James Woods is a conservative, and he does tweet out some pretty cool stuff, but none of it's hate speech. It just usually skewers the leftist narrative, and they don't like that. David Duke, who's a white supremacist jackass from Louisiana, he had his Twitter account permanently suspended earlier this year for hateful content. Now, I have to admit, I've never read any of David Duke's tweets, so I can't speak firsthand to it. But knowing what I do know about David Duke, yeah, it probably was pretty hateful. But we have a right in America to be hateful. And it's not Twitter's or Facebook's job to censor hateful speech. Donald Trump Jr. has had his Twitter account blocked because he tweeted out information about hydroxychloroquine, a treatment that may or may not be any good against the coronavirus. There are a lot of doctors saying it works. There's a lot that say it don't. Shouldn't they both be allowed to say what they want to say and allow people to make up their own minds? It's not like you can buy it over the counter anyway. You still need a doctor's prescription. So if somebody wanted it because they saw some doctor on Facebook say how good it was, and they go to their doctor and ask for it, their doctor can still say, no, I'm not giving it to you because it doesn't work. But then it's a decision between the patient and the doctor. It's not up to Facebook and Twitter to decide whose medical advice we Americans are allowed to hear and whose we're not. Candace Owens, a conservative activist, had her Twitter account suspended after tweeting criticism of Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer's stay-at-home order and encouraging the people of Michigan to violate that directive. So now we can't criticize the governor? Or we can't encourage law-breaking? Well, neither one is obviously the standard, because they allow criticism of Republican elected officials all the time. And they allow people to advocate law-breaking all the time. You know who Danielle Stella is? Well, she didn't win, which is why you don't know her. But she was a Republican challenging Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, and Twitter found that her tweets violated their rules and permanently banned her from the platform. You know what the last straw was? It was Danielle Stella's tweet that said, if it is proven Ilhan Omar passed sensitive information to Iran, she should be tried for treason and hanged. All right, well, gee, there's a big if there, and it says proven, so that's not speculation. So if it's proven that she passed, then she should be tried for treason and hanged. So not just hanged, but tried. So that's if, it's conditional, proven in court, okay, and tried, there we go, in court again. I assume she means convicted also for the and hanged part to apply. There's nothing hateful about that. But the leftists who run Twitter banned her. A candidate for political office not being allowed on a platform to communicate with the voters? Can you think of an example of censorship that is more improper than that? Where a corporation is not allowing a candidate for elected office to communicate with the voters? President Trump himself has been blocked on social media. I'll give you some examples when the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So do you think it's proper for social media companies to censor what the President of the United States says? Twitter and Facebook have done just that. In May, President Trump tweeted out the following regarding the riots in Minneapolis. And I'm quoting from his tweet at 12:53 a.m. on May 29th. Quote, "These thugs are dishonoring the memory of George Floyd, and I won't let that happen. just spoke to Governor Tim Walz and told him that the military is with him all the way. Any difficulty and we will assume control, but when the looting starts, the shooting starts. Thank you." End quote. Twitter then covered that tweet with a warning that what people would read if they clicked to uncover it would read something that glorified violence. I didn't hear anything that glorified violence. But Twitter took it on themselves to censor the President of the United States. The post was still there, but you had to take an extra step of getting past a warning to be able to view it. That happened again a month later. On June 23rd at 1:46 p.m., President Trump tweeted out, quote, "There will never be an autonomous zone in Washington, D.C. as long as I'm your president. If they try, they will be met with serious force." End quote. And Twitter then placed a safety notice over that read, "We've placed a public interest notice on this tweet for violating our policy against abusive behavior, specifically the presence of a threat of harm against an identifiable group." Really? Did you see that tweet from Donald Trump as a threat of harm? Twitter did. So they covered up the tweet, making it more difficult for the public to see what the president was saying. Also in June, Team Trump took out an ad on Facebook that Facebook removed on the grounds that it contained Nazi symbols and was hateful. What was the Nazi symbol? The Trump ad included an upside-down red triangle, which the censors at Facebook said was used during World War II at Nazi concentration camps. Which is true. Upside-down triangles were one of many symbols used to identify prisoners at Nazi concentration camps. But the upside-down red triangle is presently used by Antifa, and it is in that context the president included it in his paid campaign ad on Facebook, along with the following text. "Dangerous mobs of far-left groups are running through our streets and causing absolute mayhem. They are destroying our cities and rioting. It's absolute madness. It's important that every American comes together at a time like this to send a united message that we will not stand for their radical actions any longer. We're calling on you to make a public statement and add your name to stand with President Trump against Antifa. Please add your name immediately to stand with your president and his decision to declare Antifa a terrorist organization." Now, was there anything hateful in that? Of course not. Ironically, that same upside-down red triangle was allowed by Facebook to be used by organizations running pieces that called Trump a racist for using it, and including the image as evidence that the president's a racist. So the rule wasn't that nobody could use an upside-down red triangle on Facebook. The rule was that President Trump's campaign couldn't use an upside-down red triangle on Facebook. Facebook claimed that it violated their community standards on hate speech. Well, if what Trump said was so hateful and offensive, if that upside-down red triangle was so hateful and offensive, then shouldn't Facebook let the people see it and judge him harshly for it? For Facebook to censor the President of the United States is disgraceful and dangerous. The President of the United States should not be censored, period. If Trump had used actual Nazi swastikas and slogans and advocated Nazism, should Facebook censor it? Or should they allow it to be seen for what it is. Don't you think that politicians should sink or swim on their own merits, or lack thereof? It's not the job of Facebook or anyone else to protect us from a candidate, or to protect a candidate from himself. No political candidate's speech should be censored by anyone at any time for any reason. If the speech is that horrible and offensive, then the candidate will lose votes and thus lose the election. But censorship would deny voters that critical information about candidates, which could result in favorable votes based upon ignorance. Ignorance forced upon them by the censors, who wouldn't allow the candidate's terrible speech, and I'm not saying the president's speech was in this instance, I'm speaking in general terms, because the censors wouldn't allow the hate speech to be known. The voters don't know how terrible the candidate is. Well, I'd rather know the candidates, warts and all, uncensored. I don't need to be coddled by Facebook or Twitter or Google or anybody else because they're protecting me from some candidate's hate. If a candidate's that bad, let me see it. Let America see it so that we can make up our own minds and not be manipulated by big media. But big tech, especially social media, has taken upon itself the role of censor. They are censoring the political dialogue that largely takes place online these days, allowing people to see what they want them to see and not allowing them to see what they don't want them to see. Facebook removed and banned posts that announced any kind of back-to-work rallies calling for an end to the coronavirus closures. But they allowed posts that were organizing Black Lives Matter riots. Facebook has banned pro-life advertising on its platform. Not all of it, but some of it. But they've allowed ads, paid ads, featuring signs that say, "Death to America." Do you really want Facebook Inc. and Twitter Inc. and Google, which is actually Alphabet Inc., to be deciding what Americans get to see and what Americans don't get to see? And even when they don't remove it entirely, they often cover it up with a fact check that makes you click on the fact check first. Well, who are their so-called fact checkers? Snopes, PolitiFact, and factcheck.org. All three of which have serious deficiencies in their objectivity. But social media is not the only place that censorship is happening. I'll give you another terrible example. When the Mike Bates Show continues. Welcome back to the Mike Bates Show. This is Mike Bates. So it's not just Facebook and Twitter and Google and Snapchat and Instagram and the other social media sites that are censoring people. GoFundMe, which is the largest crowdfunding platform, deleted a campaign by a guy asking for money to pay for a White Lives Matter banner to be pulled by a plane flying over a football game. GoFundMe said they removed the campaign because it violated their terms of service. Now, if their terms of service stated that fundraising campaigns for idiots that were just trying to annoy people weren't allowed, then so be it, but that's not the case. It has more than 85,000 separate fundraising campaigns for various individuals and organizations seeking funding for Black Lives Matter. And those have raised tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. It's difficult to get a total because although the GoFundMe website will let you search campaigns and show what each has raised, there's no way to see a total unless you manually add up donations for each of the 85,602 Black Lives Matter campaigns. And I'm sure not going to take the time to do that. But I did see a few campaigns that raised well over $1 million each. The Los Angeles chapter of Black Lives Matter alone has raised more than $2.9 million via GoFundMe. And that may not be the most any BLM campaign has raised because there's no way to sort them by the contribution amounts. Even GoFundMe censors what people can solicit money for. The official GoFundMe campaign for George Floyd, the dead drug addict felon who died in Minneapolis while Officer Chauvin was kneeling on his neck, has raised more than $2.3 million via GoFundMe. A memorial fund for George Floyd raised $14.7 million on GoFundMe. And there are more than 3,800 other GoFundMe campaigns invoking George Floyd's name that have collectively raised tens of millions of dollars. Look, this is a free country. People should be able to give money to causes they believe in. My problem is not people giving money. My problem is the one-sidedness of who's allowed to receive the money. GoFundMe is not offering a level playing field to even ask for money. Justice for Jacob Blake, the guy in Kenosha, Wisconsin, who was shot by the police and paralyzed as he violently resisted arrest and was reaching in his car for a weapon. A GoFundMe account for him has raised over $2.2 million. Meanwhile, Kyle Rittenhouse, the 17-year-old who shot 3 people, 2 of whom died as he defended himself from their violent attacks during the riots that followed the lawful shooting of Jacob Blake, his legal defense fund at GoFundMe was removed. But I did do a search for Kyle Rittenhouse on the GoFundMe page, and it didn't come up empty. His legal defense fund wasn't there, but there was one active campaign using his name. And it was asking for donations to buy helmets, body armor, and walkie-talkies for the rioters so they could coordinate their illegal violence and be somewhat protected from harm by those trying to enforce the law and protect lives and property. That is allowed to raise money, and people have donated to it. But the point is not that people are willing to fund the riots that bothers me, although those donations may violate some laws about inciting violence. I don't know. What bothers me is that the leftists who run GoFundMe will allow fundraising that supports crime, but not fundraising that supports paying for defense costs of those accused of crimes. And actually, that's not entirely true because GoFundMe did allow campaigns to solicit funds to pay bail money and defense costs for the rioters who have been arrested for arson, looting, and assaulting police officers. The bail fund for rioters in Portland alone has raised more than $1.3 million. It's the double standard that bothers me. And although it isn't a violation of the First Amendment because these are private companies, big tech's censorship of third-party content is very dangerous. And arguably that censorship, First Amendment notwithstanding, is not permitted under federal law. See, what people tweet on Twitter or post on Facebook is not Twitter's or Facebook's content. If it was, they would be liable for what third parties put on their platforms. But under federal law, these social media platforms are treated as computer services, not as publishers. And the difference is legally very significant. Social media companies want to have it both ways. They want the right to censor third-party content, which would make them publishers that are responsible for all content on their platforms, and they want to be computer services that enjoy the protections provided by Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which gives them immunity from lawsuits for what third parties post. The position they choose to take varies depending on whether they're censoring people or defending themselves against lawsuits. But they cannot be both. Eventually, they will be forced by courts or legislation to be one or the other. The courts are the more likely avenue because legislation is not going to occur because Democrats benefit greatly when big tech censors their opposition. It's quite easy to win an argument when the other side doesn't get to argue. Well, President Trump thinks he can prevent censorship by social media companies via an executive order. But other than directing the Federal Communications Commission to treat social media companies as common carriers or public utilities, which I doubt he could unilaterally do, I don't see how he can force social media companies to treat all users equally vis-a-vis posted content and have such an order survive constitutional scrutiny. That being said, Congress can and should define social media as common carriers and public utilities. But they won't. Democrats love big tech's censorship because big tech is on their side. Well, my side is freedom for all. I don't fear discussion, dissent, and debate. I fear those who are afraid to engage in it and who use their power to oppress opposing views. And anyone with any decency should fear that also. Getting away from the legal argument and focusing on the societal benefits, why do you suppose it is that conservatives want free speech for all, but leftists want free speech only for themselves? It is because leftist viewpoints cannot survive rational scrutiny or factual rebuttal. Instead, they prefer hit-and-run attacks that are aided and abetted by their allies in big media and big tech, both of whom are dangerous enemies of our republic. As Democrats praise Twitter for censoring President Trump's account, remember that Twitter allows Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, to regularly tweet death threats to Jews, support for terrorists, desire for genocide, and its aspiration for the destruction of Israel. Now, to be clear, I do not advocate that Twitter censor Ali Khamenei's account or anyone else's. I advocate freedom of speech for all. Because without it, our republic will not survive. As Benjamin Franklin said, whoever would overthrow the liberty of a nation must begin by subduing the freeness of speech. I'm Mike Bates. Thanks for listening.